Dr. Hugh Jones is a long-term member of the North Shore Group. After a long career as a freshwater ecologist, he recently retired and acquired a property in the Capertee Valley. He manages it as a working cattle farm and has since enjoyed familiarising himself with both the native plants, birds and wildlife of the region. In this presentation, he shares with us his obvious love of the area.
Okay, thanks Hugh. Take it away.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I've probably made a presentation that's about go take us till midnight, but I'll work my way through it as we go and adjust my talk accordingly. There's no real theme, but I'll talk about, well, first of all, we bought this property up in the Capertee Valley probably 2 or 3 years ago now, and we've seen everything from bad droughts to bushfire to beautiful seasons. So I've just put a little circle around the part of the valley where we have our place, and we occupy most of that valley inside the black lines, and we're surrounded on both sides by Wollemi National Park. So it tucks down and ducks around sort of into the valley a bit. And what else can I say except most of the talk will be about plants in my part of the valley inside that circle. It's quite varied. You get quite a bit of variation in the vegetation throughout the valley. But I'm also going to mention some of the threatened species. The photos that I've got are from a visit I took about a month or so ago to a part of the valley where there are a couple of endangered species. So the Capertee is a really interesting area. We bought there for a few reasons, partly because really interesting diversity of birds. It's one of the best known birding spots in Australia, but it's also really good for plants, a lot of biodiversity values. It's a biodiversity hotspot, they call it, because in terms of plants, you've got quite a few endemic plants. Those are plants that just don't occur anywhere else or, have a very localised distribution. And there are at least a dozen of these, I think, which are threatened, and some of them are critically endangered, which really means that there are not many of them left and they occur in a very small area. So they're vulnerable to things like bushfire and drought and so on. Now, there's a little publication put out by the local land services, which you can get online, or there's also, I think, at Lithgow, they have hard copies of them, which mention more about the rare plants. I'm only going to talk about a few of them. But also there are some really characteristic plants in the region. One's an isopogon, drumsticks, and Isopogon dawsoni that grows up to about 3 metres. Instead of having bright yellow inflorescences like the ones around Sydney, the 2 species around here, they tend to be a more cream colour. And I've got one that's growing really well in the garden out there now. Another one's called a slaty gum or Eucalyptus dawsoni. Don't know who Dawson was, but the few things named after him. Slaty gum's a stunning big, beautiful big tree. They vary a bit, but they can have a really glossy, shiny white bark to a more mottled colour as well. Then there's a type of stringy bark which is called cannonini, which only occurs around there. I think we have a few of them up on the top of our cliffs. And then there's another one that's a threatened species. It's called Gravilla evansii, and that's a really attractive one. You might know it. You might even have it in your garden. And it tends to grow in Wollemi National Park and down around Dun Swamp. So then you've got various other things which we get on our place, which are these ironbark woodlands, which have got a mixture of species in them. And we've also got rainforest called dry rainforest or vine forest, which comes down a couple of the gullies on the place. And then we've got grassy box woodlands down on the lower slopes and creek flats where the creek goes through. And we've got mountain grey gum along the creek on that. So it's a really interesting spot. I'll talk first of all a bit about some of the endangered plant species, or these are photos of some that I took about a month ago. One of the nicest ones around would be a Fabalium called Fabalium bifidum. If you see that photo on the left, you can see how the leaves are sort of split, and it's named from that, I think. And it was only described, less than 20 years ago by someone who lives up in the Blue Mountains and has a property in the valley. She's actually a bat person, works on microbats, called Mo Turton, and she described it with Peter Weston, who from the Botanic Gardens, as you know. So it only occurs in about 3 or 4 spots around the base of Mount Jenolan and so on in the valley. And it's been in flower. It's probably finished now. But as you can see from these photos, it's a lovely little plant. And there are heaps regenerating since the drought and bushfire. So they've come back really strongly. The second one, which actually occurs in the same places generally as that Fabalium, is a Gravilla called obtuse flora. There are 2 subspecies which are both endangered, or they're listed as endangered. And that's regenerating really well as well. It's quite a nice little plant when you see a good bushy one. And there's quite a lot of actually interesting plants that occur around with it. There are some mint bushes and other things which tend to occur on isolated peaks around the valley and a couple of pea flowers and a few other things, which I won't talk more about. I suppose that's a subject for another talk, really. This photo is taken from the cliffs on the eastern side of the place, basically a fair bit of our property in there. Put this in because there are a couple of different sort of environments that I'll talk about, some of the plants that you find in around there. Now, this big peak on the other side is called Tayan Peak, and it's a basalt-capped mountain, and there are a few of them around there, and they tend to have really quite unusual vegetation communities associated with them. And you'll see, and then the top area out there can be quite varied, and you get some pagoda landscapes in amongst it, and then some gullies with a bit of rainforest, and also and then you get to these cliff lines, and often you have some distinctive species that are associated with these rocky cliff lines as well. And you might notice in the middle of the photo where my cursor is that it's a bit darker green, and then a bit further over there. That's actually the dry rainforest, which has a couple of species. It has what's it called? You often get some large, big figs in there, I think rubiginosa, and there's something, it'll come to me later, another small rainforest tree and a few others, and quite a lot of vines and things like cissus and the water vine, and also Pandorea. There's a white-flowered form, really spectacular. It'd be in full flower. And quite a lot of other small plants that grow down associated with it. It's quite moist. And then below the cliffs, you get what they call the talus slopes, which are this rocky, sandstony, very sandy soils. And they're often covered with ironbark and other species. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then there's the grassy woodland, which is partly cleared on this place, and we're letting it come back a bit more, and that's got its own community. And the creek flats, as you can see, have been cleared of trees pretty much. We'll try and fix that up. So here's photos above the cliff line on the western side of that photo there. You can see that it's really quite dense vegetation. You've got pagodas, large sandstone structures with narrow corridors between them, and you've got your distinct vegetation. You've got a mixture of stringy bark or blackthorn stringy bark up there, which and also another type of mallee called Leophylla, Eucalyptus leophylla, which only occurs in this pagoda landscape of the Wollemi and Nunes area. So up near that peak, Tower Peak, there's also some unusual things. And one of the things I found when I went up there, I think it was in April, was this daisy, and I think it might be a type of snow daisy, but I'm not sure. I don't know if any of you can recognise it, but really quite interesting things there, some unique Gravillas and so on as well. There's you get some of the coastal species like old man Banksia up on those upper slopes as well, and then it varies in other sections. You've got this Ironbark woodland. I think this is mostly Crebra up here, which is a narrow-leafed ironbark, but you get the brown stringy bark as well, and then the unique species called Cannoni, which is very closely related to Macrorhyncha. You also get grey gums and other things as well. Now, the Boronias you get up there, but you don't get lower down below the cliff line. And this one, I think, is Boronia rubiginosa, and spectacular in flower, often, really bright pink and flowers and deep green leaves. Things like Herbatia monogyna, which is this small little herbatia. See how it's got these cunea-type leaves in that little inset there? And then around the cliff lines, you get species like this Cloanthes, which you can see in the middle there's a little one of its tubular flowers. You get the Rebeckias and a whole host of other things. There's various tea trees. That Isopogon dawsoni occurs up amongst in the cliff top vegetation as well. A whole range of things. Lots of stylidiums in the ground cover coming back since the bushfires. It's really quite spectacular. This is on the edge of the cliff line. The property's down past my friend who's pointing up to the top there, where there's a heap of rock orchids. So you're sort of near the western limits of a lot of species that you associate with the coastal and the mountain vegetation. Even you get a mix of the western species of vegetation, but you still got these eastern species like this Dendrobium speciosum, which I think it's changed. What is it, Selichiton or something now, but I can't remember what it's been renamed to. So this is the view down off the cliffs. I just sort of popped that in. So most of the trees that you can see down here is a mix of ironbark, largely ironbark, but you've got slaty gum, Dawsoni, in the lower sections, and you also get quite a few grey gum interspersed amongst it as well. So I'll talk next about the valley floor, which is so this is looking down from a basalt outcrop. This soil in the front's basalt, and growing on it is a type of snowgrass, Poa libillardieri. It's hard to pronounce, which tends to grow on these basalt soils. And along this creek line here is mainly apple box, Angophora floribunda, and mixed in is mountain grey gum and some forest red gum, Tereticornis. These little shrubs here are hickory wattle. And then you also get some very large currajong growing through the valley here. That's a couple just here as well. Some of the trees in this valley are really quite large. This is a really old forest red gum. With me in there, you can see that it's a really large specimen. It's a grassy woodland that's been opened up a lot by grazing. Since this photo's been taken, quite a lot of eucalypts have started coming up with the release of grazing pressure through this section. But in amongst the grey box and the red gum, and there's also grey box trees and white box trees, so a mixture of coastal species and species from the western slopes occur through here. There's a lot of different herbs and forbs in the understory through here as well. So in here you've got a few red gums, another apple box. This is a white box, and there are some grey box in there as well, just out of the view. In places there are quite a lot of blackthorn, which is Berseria spinosa, and we get a lot of double bar finches nesting in those and using that, and some of the other small birds as well, some of the fairy wrens. These birds on the creek flats, where we get quite a few thistles in the last year with the season, I'll use them as nesting as well. So even the so-called weeds, they can be really useful habitat for some of these species. A lot of butterflies. This is a Meadow Argus, which I think is a bit of a generalist. Its larvae use quite a lot of plants, I think, including some of the grasses as well, to develop on. And on the lower right, it's called a varied swordgrass brown. And they tend to feed on a type of on species of Garnia. And we, in various parts of the woodland, we have quite a lot of Garnia aspera, which only grows, about half a metre or so in height. But I suspect they must be using that as a food plant. Also, quite a bit of wildlife in these in the woodland, grassy woodlands as well. This is a red nape snake that I took a photo of about 6 months ago, and we get a lot of brown snakes and highland copperheads and things like that as well. So in the herbs and grasses, especially in the more protected moist areas, get a lot of Austral bugle. You get since the fires, a lot of this plantain. We get native mint scattered through in patches. That also occurs all through the valley in the grassland. You get quite extensive patches of it, as you can see, in places. And a huge variety of grasses. Many of them are introduced, but there are still various native grasses. One of my favourites is forest hedgehog grass, which and has these really distinctive little heads on it. But there are, a lot of wallaby grasses, kangaroo grass on the drier slopes in particular, and probably one of the most dominant grasses through the place is weeping grass, which is Microlina stipoides. About a year ago, when the drought broke in the spring, we got a lot of gardenia coming up through the grasslands, and we get that also through the rocky slopes. It's mostly gardenia not heterophylla, Heteracea. But you can see in this photo, there's also this large three-leafed vine, which is a species of Desmodium. And I gather they've recently, or found out today, that they've split that genus into a number of different genera now as well. We also get a lot of the other legumes we get in there, quite a lot of glycines in the grasslands as well. In some of the more protected areas, we get quite a lot of solanums, including this one called Solanum prinophilum, and another one is Brownii. So they're really actually quite common through there. On the more stony areas, when you're starting to get onto the stony slopes, get quite a lot of burr daisy, this one Calotus lapulaceae, which I've also got growing in our garden, and the Pilliga posey, which must be very widespread west of the Dividing Range. It occurs throughout our hillsides through there. And there's also, in some parts of the valley, you'll get just paddocks full of this yellow buttons, or Chrysocephalum apiculatum. It's a really hardy species, and yeah, it's a beautiful plant. Now, talking more about the talus slopes, the stony rocky slopes that are immediately below the cliffs, that's dominated on our place anyway by ironbark, and I think most of it is Crebra. We get a bit of another one which is a narrow-leafed ironbark. We also get some with the broad-leafed ironbark, and intermixed with grey gum. So there's one in the foreground here. It's very stony, and underneath, much of it has very little vegetation, as you can see. There's also black cypress pine through here. So, so some parts of it, really very little vegetative ground cover. But where you do get it, it tends to be dominated by plants like ernheath, the peach heath, which is a Lathancy, and in some places there's some of this cranberry heath as well. And in the last month or so, there's been quite a few orchids, and mostly this one called the Blue Fairy. Although there was another one that I saw last year, which was a little white one. I haven't got a photo of it. Now, there's in some patches, you get this Hovea lanceolata. That can grow up to about 1.5 metres or so in height. And when it's in flower, it's quite stunning. It's a really nice plant. The rest of the time, it's sort of just fairly grey and inconspicuous. In patches where I think that the place must have been quite heavily overgrazed with sheep at one stage, but there are in places where the grass is coming back. I don't know the name of this grass, but it's a very wiry one. It's not an ostrastiper. I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm not very good on my grasses. But there's also snowgrass, Poa siberiana, in places as well. And in some areas, it's quite dense. But where it's a bit more protected, and also in the upper parts of that slope near the cliff line, you can get quite a lot of mintbush or Prosanthera. And the common one that we get on our place is rotundifolia. You can see here it's been in flower, and it's a really beautiful plant. We also get things like Stopandra, which has this blue flower. It's sort of a grass-like shrub. We get a lot of Indigifera australis. It'd be in full bloom now. You just get whole hillsides which are in flower with it. I don't have any photos of that at the moment. I stole this one off the internet, I'll have to admit. And hot bushes, I think there are actually two species. There's this one and another one called Dodonea truncalis, but they're coming back really strongly in the last year or so. So they'll probably bring the small birds back as well. And in places you get some unusual things. I only found one of these. It's called Austral trefoil or Lotus australis. And that's a little shrub that grows only about 30 centimetres high, and it might cover half a metre or so, and grows on sort of stony soils. It's a beautiful shrub. So try and propagate that one. We do get a lot of wattles. I think there are at least 13 or more in the valley, from things like mudgy wattle, another one called weeping boree, which is acacia, what's it called, not viscosa, but some of the common ones on our place, along our creek lines, is dominated with the regeneration, is dominated by the fernleaf wattle or Acacia falciparia. You get in one of probably my favourite is something called the western silver wattle, which only grows to about a metre and a half. Beautiful silvery foliage and the yellow-brown stems, and smothered in flowers when it's in bloom. Other ones that are common around there in certain different parts of the valley, you can get a lot of the boxleaf wattle, Acacia buxifolia. We've also got thickets of kangaroo thorn or Acacia paradoxa in some parts of the property. That's a really good habitat plant, and that's thickening up in some areas. Some people worry that these things will take over their properties, but they don't. One of the more common ones, there are two really. There's this one, which I think is the mallee wattle or Acacia montana, which is quite widespread on the western slopes of New South Wales, and another one called the varnish wattle or verniciflua, which is quite similar, but it's got shorter phyllodes than this. There are a few others, but I'll leave those at the moment. We got impacted pretty badly by the Gospers Mountain bushfire from December 2019 through to, about the 10th of January, I think, when we finally got it out. But here it is. What it did is it came over the cliffs on the eastern side and also down some of the little chimneys that enter into the valley. And once it sort of roared over the cliffs, it slows right down. So that looks pretty serious there. But it's actually moving very slowly, like metres per hour, and if that. And so it would take, 4 or 5 days to get down to the fire trails where we can attack it. But it's pretty spectacular. And although it wasn't really flaring up like at least on our property, like it did, say, down on the south coast, it just wouldn't stop burning. And, for weeks after this fire finished, you'd just hear the crash of these huge trees falling down in the forest where they were just slowly burning through the roots, which is pretty sad. But we've still got a lot of large ones, and it has caused a lot of regeneration. So these slopes here were like in one of those earlier photos with nothing on the ground, and it's just smothered in Hardenbergia right now. It's absolutely beautiful. A lot of the little small ones that are not flowering at that stage in the front are this type of pea called Pultonea microphylla. This is one of the first ones coming to flower in this photo, but the plants would just be smothered in these yellowy orange flowers at the moment. Other things you get a lot of in places coming up were a lot of Austral bugle, especially on the lower slopes. In some areas, this Pomex or Pomexumbilata, it's got these little umbels of flower heads all over it, and it just totally covers the ground in places. There's another P in the background, not in flower. Plantain, we didn't see any of it before the fire, and in places it's just come up really thickly, and there are quite a lot of herbs and things that have done that. Here's a type of Senecio. I think it's probably a native, but I haven't tried to identify it to species. There you can see at the base of I think it's a young ironbark, a whole lot of lignotuberous regrowth coming back, and here's also a solanum. Solanums, with the purple flowers and the yellow centres, are often very much fire responsive species. You tend to get a lot of regeneration of them after the fire. This what we've got in here is actually worth looking at quite closely. There's just such a variety of things. These long-stemmed leaves here are actually, they put up these flower spikes with these tiny little lily flowers. I think it's Arthropodium milliflorum it's called, or pale vanilla lily. If you look in some of these, I think here they look like a geranium leaf. Not 100% certain. I need to go back and see if they're in flower. Then there are, what other things? Oxalis on the photos on the right, and that could quite easily be a native one. Here, this little yellow flower I've identified, that was a thing called a small St. John's wort, or Hypericum gramineum. It's actually a native, not an introduced species like the weed St. John's wort. There's Dichondra. You can see a young Indigifera seedling coming up. It's just fascinating, and there's glycine in there. These trifoliate long leaves, I think it's Glycine tabacina. They're also the Desmodium, which has got a broader leaf. Where did I see that? I can't show you now. But they've actually changed the genus name of that now. So that's it, I think.
If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and view other great content? New videos being added all the time.